And now we move on to the anterior pituitary. We're going to have to split up the anterior pituitary over a couple of lectures because there's a whole lot going on with the anterior pituitary, as we can see here on this diagram. Okay, so as I'm freaking myself out here for a minute. As I mentioned on the last video lecture, don't be surprised when the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary get switched from the left to the right, from diagram to diagram. So here's our anterior pituitary over here on this side with this particular diagram. All right, so as we talked about earlier, the anterior pituitary consists of glandular tissue, and you have cells in that gland that make various hormones. Those hormones are listed for you over here, and so you should learn the names of these hormones and their abbreviations as well. So you got growth hormone, which is abbreviated as GH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which is also known as thyrotropin, or TSH. Then there's adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, luteinizing hormone, or LH is the abbreviation for that one. And then we also have prolactin, which is, or PRL is the abbreviation for that, which is another hormone that's actually involved with breast milk. So we're going to talk about what the functions of these hormones as we go through the anterior pituitary. And now several of these hormones actually stimulate the production of other hormones. So they're going to be hormones that are involved in hormonal control as well. Okay, so those are the hormones that are secreted out of the anterior pituitary. They're made by cells in the anterior pituitary. They get secreted. They enter into the blood vessels in that capillary plexus, that capillary bed that surrounds the anterior pituitary, and then they get carried away from there, and they travel all throughout the body where they can go on the wild hunt for their targets. All right, now as we also talked a little bit about earlier, the hormones down in here that are made by the anterior pituitary, well, what triggers their production? What controls their production? Well, it's actually these neurons you have up here in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, remember we said that is the master of the master. So the pituitary gland, because it makes so many different hormones, is often called the master gland. Well, the master does not produce hormones unless it's told to by its master, which consists of some of these neurons up in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, you have hypothalamus neurons that produce releasing hormones, and in other cases inhibiting hormones that travel that little short distance through the infundibulum inside those portal veins, travels down toward the anterior pituitary, and then those hormones influence whether or not your anterior pituitary is going to make these various hormones that you see over there on the left. So some of the story gets a little complex here, and you just have to be organized and outline things and start writing out pathways to keep track of how one thing leads to the next. This is a diagram which is actually from an older textbook that we used to use, but I thought it was a pretty good one to include here. So what they're showing you up here on top, these are the names of hormones that are made by the hypothalamus, which act on the anterior pituitary. Okay, so all of these hormones that you see up here travel that short little distance from the hypothalamus through the portal veins down to the anterior pituitary, and they tell the cells in the anterior pituitary what to do. So what they're showing you up here, for example, the hypothalamus, you have neurons up there that produce GH, that's growth hormone releasing hormone, or somatostatin, SS, that is another name for GH GHIH, which stands for growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So some of the terminology here, you got to pay close attention to it because it can get a little confusing. Growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH, travels down to the anterior pituitary, so that's its target, and it triggers the anterior pituitary to secrete growth hormone, or GH. All right, in contrast, somatostatin, which is also known as GHIH, and that's the terminology your textbook is using, does the opposite. Notice the little negative sign there. It tells cells in the anterior pituitary, don't produce as much growth hormone. Okay, so these two hormones up here, made by the hypothalamus, control whether or not the anterior pituitary is secreting growth hormone. And then what they're showing you down here, these are the major targets of these anterior pituitary hormones. So growth hormone, when it's made, travels throughout the body and influences many tissues in the body, including your osseous tissues in the bone, muscular tissues, and has influence on adipose tissues as well. And we'll see more about that shortly. All right, let me erase all of that. Okay, and then over here what we're seeing, the next line, or the next section, the hypothalamus also makes a hormone called prolactin releasing factor, or PRF, and PIH is prolactin release inhibiting hormone, or prolactin inhibiting hormone. So those travel from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and they control whether or not the anterior pituitary makes prolactin. Okay, prolactin, its main target is the mammary glands. Prolactin triggers milk production. Remember how we talked about oxytocin triggers milk letdown, squeezing of the milk that's already made toward the nipple? Prolactin is a hormone that actually tells the mammary glands to produce more milk. So those functions are not the same. All right, and then we have a hormone called TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. That's a hypothalamus hormone that tells the anterior pituitary to make TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. TSH then travels to the thyroid gland, and as we'll see when we talk more about the thyroid, it tells the thyroid to make more of the hormones it's supposed to make. So some of this again gets a little complex. It's you have several cases here where a hypothalamus hormone triggers the anterior pituitary to secrete a hormone, and then that hormone travels to some other location and triggers that gland to make one or more hormones. So you've got different switches that wind up getting flipped before some of these endocrine glands finally make the hormones they're supposed to produce. Okay, and then another case of this in the hypothalamus makes a hormone called CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone, and that triggers the anterior pituitary to make ACTH, which is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and ACTH travels through the blood, and its target is the superficial sections of the adrenal glands. Those areas are called the adrenal cortex, which maybe you've done the anatomy portion already and you've learned about the adrenal cortex over there. Those are the portions of the adrenal glands that are near the surface. All right, so ACTH, adrenocortico, that refers to adrenal cortex, that portion of the adrenal glands. Tropic, again, whenever you see that term, it's tropic, not tropic, that's letting you know that's a hormone whose target is another endocrine gland. So ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, its target, that's telling you its target is the adrenal cortex. Then up here you had CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. It's telling the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone. So that's where it got its name from. Some of the terminology is logical and some of it slips out of logic a little bit from time to time, so you just have to learn it and be careful with it. Finally, the hypothalamus also makes a hormone called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so releasing hormones, again, are made by the hypothalamus, and their targets are going to be the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary makes various tropic hormones that then travel from the anterior pituitary to other endocrine glands and cause those glands to produce other hormones. All right, so the anterior pituitary makes a couple of different hormones. These are called LH and FSH. LH stands for luteinizing hormone. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So GnRH triggers the anterior pituitary to make those two hormones. The targets are the ovaries in females, the testes in males. So these are hormones that are very closely involved with sperm production in males, and then egg production in females. Are also involved with the menstrual cycles that occur in females as well from month to month. We're not going to talk a lot about these LH and FSH and GnRH at this point during the semester, because we're going to have a whole unit on the reproductive system where we will talk a whole lot more about what those hormones do. You'll hear all of the gory details later during the semester. All right, so that's an overview of the various anterior pituitary hormones and what triggers their production. The anterior pituitary is under hormonal control. It's controlled by hormones made by the hypothalamus. So learn those little step-by-step pathways. All right, now let's more specifically talk about growth hormone, or GH. This also has another name, somatotropin, but usually I don't use somatotropin. GH, or growth hormone, is the name you're going to hear the most. All right, so the anterior pituitary, as you just saw, makes many different kinds of hormones. So there are actually different cells within the anterior pituitary whose job it is to make these different hormones. So that's what your somatotropic cells are. Those are cells that manufacture somatotropin, which is another name for growth hormone. Somato refers to the body, so that's letting you know that this hormone is going to act on cells located throughout the body. All right, so what does this hormone do? Obviously, it is going to encourage growth. You can just tell that by its name. But a term you should associate with growth: synthesis. If you're growing, you're making more cells, you're making more tissues, you're increasing, like in your connective tissues. Remember all those protein fibers you have in your connective tissues throughout the body? Well, you got to make those proteins. Cells in those tissues have to make all of those substances. So growth requires lots of synthesis. So this hormone, what it does is it sets up the conditions in the body that permit growth and all of this synthesis that supports this growth. So one thing that it does is it increases blood levels of fatty acids. All right, so where do you store fats? Remember your adipocytes, your adipose tissues. Growth hormone actually stimulates release of those fatty acids that are stored in your adipocytes. So they move into the blood. Why? Because fatty acids, as we all know, store energy. They're very efficient at storing energy, a little bit too efficient for many of us, especially as we start getting older. They get even more efficient at doing that job. And so if you release more of those fatty acids from storage, they are available to provide fuel for your cells. Why do your cells need fuel? Because they're going to be doing lots and lots and lots of synthesis. They're going to be building things for growth. Remember, synthesis requires energy. You've got to power building things. Where do cells get their energy? Remember, ATP. Anytime you hear about synthesis, building, producing inside the body, think ATP, because you got to have energy to make that happen. Cells use ATP as their preferred source of energy. And taking that even one step further, all right, so if cells they need more energy, where do they get that energy from? How do they make ATP? They've got to do their cellular respiration process. They have to break down nutrients. You harness some of the energy out of those nutrients and store it in the form of ATP. Then the ATP can be used kind of like gasoline or fuel to power all of this synthesis that's going to happen. So fatty acids are a great fuel for powering cellular respiration. So that's the other topic I was telling you. Go back and review those basics about cellular respiration, because it does. You don't have to know all the gory details, but this comes up over and over and over again during this part of anatomy and physiology. All right, so that makes sense. If you just think about many of these things logically, that helps me remember what these hormones do. Hopefully it'll help you as well. Now, interestingly, this almost doesn't make sense at first. Growth hormone decreases the rate of glucose uptake and metabolism. But if we think about it a little bit deeper, that does make sense. It's conserving glucose. So the neurons in your glucose is the preferred source of energy for cells. That's the type of nutrient that they can break down the quickest to make ATP. So guess what? The neurons up in your brain, they really need that glucose. They don't have time to break down other types of molecules like fatty acids and use those for energy. That takes a little bit longer to happen. So when growth hormone is stimulating all of this activity, this growth, this synthesis in the body, you don't want the cells that are building those things to hog all the glucose and steal the glucose away from the brain. So what growth hormone does is it tells these other locations in the body, like your skeletal muscles, for example, don't take up as much glucose. We need to conserve the glucose for the brain. Instead, you use fatty acids for fuel. Okay, another thing it does is glycogen. Remember glycogen from your AMP1 class? Glycogen consists of chains of glucose molecules. Your skeletal muscles have glycogen in them. Your liver has glycogen in it. Those are storage molecules for glucose. And when you need glucose, you break the bonds between those glucose molecules. Those glucoses move back into the bloodstream and they help supply glucose for where it is needed. Like we were just talking about, your brain likes to always have a nice supply of glucose. So growth hormone is doing that. That's part of this conserving glucose type idea. That's also considered to be an anti-insulin effect. Insulin, as we'll talk about later, that's a pancreas hormone, triggers your cells to uptake glucose rather than release stored glucose. So that's what's meant by anti-insulin effect. All right, so growth hormone triggers synthesis. It also indirectly stimulates growth, formation of collagen. Remember, you have collagen protein fibers that fill all of your connective tissues, the bone matrix that you learned about in Biology 201. The biggest targets for growth hormone, bone and skeletal muscle. That's why sometimes like bodybuilders, for example, will take growth hormone as a supplement to try to help increase the size of skeletal muscles. Another thing that growth hormone does, so we just mentioned how growth hormone triggers the release of stored fats from your adipocytes. So you know how bodybuilders like to lean out if they're going to be in a competition or something, they want their body fat levels to decrease as much as possible. Well, growth hormone, when you take that as a supplement, it can help you lose body fat, if you have to get super, super, super lean. All right, this figure is showing you some things that, some of the functions of growth hormone, which we've already talked about. So we already talked about what it does with fats. We talked about the impacts on carbohydrates. It's just outlined for you here. Over here, indirect action. So we said that the growth hormone has impacts on the skeletal system, the muscular system, other parts of the body as well. And the reason those actions are considered to be indirect is because growth hormone, really the main target is in the liver and some other tissues, and it tells those tissues to make insulin-like growth factors, or IGFs. These are proteins that really, they are the ones that signal the skeletal system or cartilages to grow, or increased protein synthesis, cell growth, cell division. That's what's meant by proliferation. Those things are really triggered by these IGFs, or insulin-like growth factors. So growth hormone leads to IGFs being made. The IGFs are actually what trigger those effects. Also over here on this particular diagram, we are seeing an example of negative feedback. All right, which you learn about in ANP1. Growth hormone levels in the body in general are maintained within a homeostatic range that fluctuates throughout the day. So that's what they're showing you here. As growth hormone levels increase, or if insulin-like growth factor levels increase, the hypothalamus up here detects that, and the hypothalamus will then make less GHRH. Okay, and if you have less GHRH, guess what happens over here to your growth hormone levels? It goes down. Okay, then if your growth hormone levels are down, you're going to have lower levels of these IGFs. You have fewer of these. Well, then this inhibition stops. So the hypothalamus is no longer detecting that. And so then the hypothalamus makes more GHRH. More GHRH tells the anterior pituitary over here to make more growth hormone. And so your levels of growth hormone go back up. And then you just keep repeating that particular story. So interestingly, growth hormone itself has negative feedback on its own production. It goes back and it tells the hypothalamus, hey, don't make as much of that GHRH that's stimulating my own production, because we don't need as much of me around. So that's the first example we're seeing here of negative feedback control of the concentration of a particular hormone in the body. Alrighty, so this slide is basically outlining some of the things that I just talked about over on the other diagram, and so is this one, so I'm not going to go back through and repeat that story. I didn't mention, though, there is a hunger hormone, a hormone that's involved in triggering the hunger sensation that makes you want to eat some more. And this hormone called ghrelin apparently also is involved in stimulating release of growth hormone. And if you think about it logically, all right, so if you're hungry, your body cells still need nutrients. Well, hey, this dude's not eating any food, so maybe we need to break down some of our stored fat to provide fatty acids to the cells of the body so that they continue to have a source of nutrients until this doofus finally gets around to eating again. So that makes sense. Growth hormone, we just talked about, is a hormone that triggers your fat cells to release that stored fat and supply it to the various cells of the body. So when you think about it logically, that does make sense that a hunger hormone would be tied to growth hormone. All right, some interesting homeostatic imbalances of growth hormone. You may have talked about the... All right, hang on. I'm probably going to have a weird glitch here with this particular video. I had a memory crash on my computer. So picking up again, homeostatic imbalances of growth hormone. So what if this hormone is overproduced? That would be called hypersecretion. So don't forget your prefixes hyper and hypo. Hypersecretion means excessive production. In children, this results in a condition called gigantism, like you see over here, where you have an excessively tall person. You know, when you have these people who are like over 8 feet tall, they almost always have gigantism, and that's due to overproduction of growth hormone during childhood. In adults, you develop a condition called acromegaly. Acromegaly is a condition where your bones are wider and thicker, so they can cause you to have features like a very blocky, well-pronounced jawline, protruding forehead, protruding brow, thick fingers, things like that. Other bones of the body will become thicker as well. That's called acromegaly. Gigantism is where you're actually very tall in height. So what's the difference between the two? Why do children, if they have an overproduction of growth hormone, become dramatically tall, whereas if you're an adult when this happens, you develop bone thickening or acromegaly? Well, that goes back to the growth plates, if you remember those from when you study the skeletal system. Growth hormone triggers excessive mitosis at the growth plates in children, and so their bones get longer and longer and longer and longer, so you wind up as a giant. In an adult, when your growth plates are already closed, you don't have bone lengthening anymore. That's not even a possibility. Your bones can still get thicker. You can have new bone matrix produced around the edges of the bone, and so that's why you wind up with these thick bone type features, and that's called acromegaly. Hyposecretion or underproduction of growth hormone in children results in a type of dwarfism called pituitary dwarfism. That's a type of dwarf where the very short height, but all of the body parts are in proportion to each other. They really do look like a little miniature person with normal body proportions. The more typical type of dwarfism that you see is a cartilage defect, where you have shorter limbs, but your head and torso are essentially the same size. That's the more typical type of dwarfism that you see. All right, and then a little bit about prolactin. We'll talk more about prolactin when we cover the reproductive system at the end of the semester. So remember, you have, there are hypothalamus hormones, a releasing hormone and an inhibiting hormone that control whether or not PRL is secreted. And PRL is made by the anterior pituitary, and it is actually in the breasts of females. You have the mammary glands on each side, and so there are cells in there that actually make the milk, and they secrete it, and it's stored in those compartments that you see there. So PRL stimulates milk production. Oxytocin stimulates milk letdown, as I've mentioned before. Males also make PRL, prolactin. The role of PRL in males is not understood yet. Obviously, it's not used for breast milk production. Inhibition of prolactin, incidentally, controlled by PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, and that is actually dopamine. So you hear about dopamine when you study the nervous system, and this is a different role for dopamine. The same chemical is having a different role in the body. So as far as regulation, when a woman is pregnant, her blood levels of PRL go up toward the end of pregnancy. That's why the mammary glands begin to produce milk and increase in size. The suckling of the infant triggers that milk to actually get squeezed towards the nipple due to oxytocin production. If PRL is overproduced, it can cause, for some reason, can cause inappropriate lactation. Lactation is milk production. Interestingly, it can also cause a lack of menses, that's the menstrual cycle in females, can actually lead to infertility and even impotence in males. So PRL has some functions that we don't really understand all that well yet in both females and males as well. All right, so prolactin and growth hormone are the two anterior pituitary hormones that don't go off and tell other endocrine glands to make their hormones. The rest of the anterior pituitary hormones, that's what they do. They actually leave the anterior pituitary and then they go to places like the thyroid and the adrenal cortex and tell those glands to make the hormones that they're supposed to make. So in lecture number 8, I'm going to talk about what those hormones do, but really the functions of those hormones will be covered in more detail when we talk about other endocrine glands like the thyroid and the adrenal glands.